free inquiry, reasoned discussion of multiple viewpoints in a civil manner, right? It's foundational. And in law school, it's one thing in college, although there it's just as bad. And we need to foster, values that support the Calvin Report and institutional neutrality. But in law school, with adults who are going to become practicing attorneys who represent the best and worst and the right and the left of society, it was really quite astonishing, actually.
Hey there, David. Hello, Spencer. How are you?
Doing great. How are you?
Doing well. This is Glenn Loury of The Glenn Show. I teach at Brown University, and I am John Paulson Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. The Manhattan Institute sponsors The Glenn Show. And this week I'm joined by David Sachs, who is a first-year law student at Stanford Law, and Spencer Segal, who's also a first-year law student at Stanford Law. David, I have to confess, is someone I'm very fond of. He's a friend, a former student, a colleague. We taught together. We spent 2 years developing and implementing a course on free inquiry at Brown, which I'm very proud of. One of the high points of my teaching career was working with David. And Spencer is a renowned first-year law student. Everybody says he's at the head of the class. I don't know where that came from, Spencer, but they admire you. The people I've spoken to admire you for some reason.
I wouldn't listen too closely to what they have to say.
Spencer is an undergraduate at Stanford and has a master's degree from Stanford, is a first-year law student there. And we're here to talk about what everybody is talking about Stanford Law. Now, a while ago, there was an incident at Yale Law School where a Federalist Society event was interrupted or disrupted or something. And I thought that was an anomaly. I said, top-line law school, these kind of cancel culture, deplatforming things going on, that's not supposed to happen at a law school. Now, apparently, with the disruption of the event that the Stanford Federalist sponsored, in which federal judge Kyle Duncan was not, in effect, allowed to present his speech, we're back to square one, it seems, on this issue of free speech in law schools. But I don't want to prejudice the conversation, and you guys are firsthand. Now, I take it that you're both members, how they said, openly members of the Federalist Society community at the Stanford Law School. Do I get that right?
Yeah.
Yes, we are. Yes.
Okay, so let me just ask David. What happened, David, out there? And can you just give us a reprise on the events?
Yeah, so our society invited Kyle Duncan, a federal judge from the Fifth Circuit, to speak on, I think it was guns in COVID in particular, and social media, I think. And the Fifth Circuit is a particularly interesting circuit. Some call it like one of the most conservative circuits. And I think we all were interested in what he might have to say on those topics. But a few days before the event, I think, these flyers started circulating, Kyle Duncan, FedSoc, you should be ashamed, including posters that actually revealed the names and faces of our executive board. And they were posted around the courtyard, like around the law school. And basically, it seemed like something was going to happen. And so, Spencer and I have slightly different experiences with the lead up to the event. Spencer went to the event early, although there was a big protest outside the event. They had already lined up. I witnessed some of the protest and walked in with Dean Steinbach. And then the event took place. And essentially what happened at the event was there was about 10 minutes of the judge Tim, our president, giving the speech. And then the judge was beginning to give his prepared remarks. And he was basically heckled at every sentence with a mix of, comments about his, snarky comments about his judgeship, also comments that really didn't have anything to do with his judgeship. And eventually the event devolved into a somewhat heated exchange, I think is a mild way of putting it, between the judge and some of the protesters. I should also mention that the room was packed. The FedSoc members, and also I think members who just in general went to listen to the event, were outnumbered considerably. Many people went peacefully. They just held up signs, or they just listened and asked pointed questions in the Q&A. But there were some who heckled and disrupted the event. I think that's a start.
Go ahead, Spencer. You want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, David covered, I think, the opening, which, personally, I can speak for myself and say that it was very disappointing to see so many of our classmates, basically trying to shout down a federal judge instead of hearing what he had to say. But that wasn't even the most troubling part of what happened, because that was, like David said, about 10 to 15 minutes in, when it was clear that the judge wasn't going to be able to give his remarks. And at that point, he asked for help from the administrator. And that's when Dean Steinbach, the associate dean at the law school for diversity, equity, and inclusion, stepped up to the podium. She took the podium from Judge Duncan, and then she proceeded to agree with the protesters to attack Judge Duncan's record, say that his judgments had landed as a total disenfranchisement of the rights of the people in the room, and that he should be listening and learning from them. And then she asked the now famous question, is the juice worth the squeeze? And she essentially asked, she said, look, in one breath, I believe in freedom of speech, but in the next one, but maybe when speech causes this much division, we have to ask if it's really worth the squeeze. And it was at that moment that I kind of realized, wow, this is going to be a real problem when the person who's been tasked with actually ensuring that we have a space where free speech and discussion can happen is stepping in, not only taking a side, but then basically trying to get the judge to leave. And so, she spoke for about 6 minutes. She took about 6 minutes of our
longer
event time. Yeah, perhaps longer. And then at that point, the judge, was allowed to take the podium again at his own event that we were sponsoring. And then, about half of the protesters left, but the rest stayed. And then there was a fairly contentious question and answer period. And to David's point, in fairness, there were several of our classmates who were there protesting who I thought, acted well within the boundaries of what's appropriate. They held signs, they asked difficult questions, but there were also a lot of people who I think went well outside the bounds of not just decorum and these, kind of high-minded ideals of politeness and civility, but violated the rules of the actual university's speech code, and who insisted on interrupting, who insisted on shouting over answers that they didn't like. And I think that was really the rest of the event was this kind of shouting match back and forth. Judge Duncan was heated by this point. And so really it just devolved into a shouting match. And in the end, the judge ended the event when it was clear that, there was going to be no more rational discussion that was going to happen.
Let me interrupt just for a minute. I'll just say while I have you here, Spencer, I saw the video of Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Steinbach's response. She had prepared remarks. She was reading prepared remarks, man. That blew my mind. That blew my mind.
The worst part to me was that Judge Duncan, when she comes up, she had not introduced herself to him prior to the event. And she comes up to the podium when he asks for help, and he says, all right, can we talk? And she says, no, I want to talk to the room. And he says, why? I want to just talk to a dean. She's like, yes, I'm a dean. Let's talk together. And people are yelling, at Judge Duncan, let her speak. They already apparently knew she was going to speak. Let her speak. Let her speak. And then at that point, she takes out remarks, and he's like, well, really, you're going to talk? And she said, yes, just because you asked, I'm going to just answer your question. And then she starts reading from this typed up page of remarks that she had prepared beforehand. So the whole thing, I think, was, the judge's words were, it was a setup. And it sure looked like it.
Okay, let me just tell the audience that we're waiting for David Sachs to rejoin the conversation. And because we don't want to waste time, we're just carrying on here. But David will be back momentarily. What's so bad about Kyle Duncan? Was he appointed by the infamous Donald J. Trump? Is that the problem? Or is he a Christian? Or I don't know. I honestly haven't done the research on Judge Duncan, but What prompted this?
Right. So Judge Duncan was appointed by President Trump to the Fifth Circuit. He is a Christian. So before his service on the bench, he worked as a litigator, most famously for the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. So he did a lot of litigation, on the topic of gay marriage. And obviously that in itself is going to attract a lot of controversy. But then I think most saliently to the protesters at Stanford Law School, he also issued an opinion as a judge in which he denied a motion by a litigant to use her preferred pronouns. It was a transgender woman. And so that was, I think, really the impetus for this whole protest. And it was really the source of, I think, a lot of the ire toward Judge Duncan.
I see. Was the litigant in his courtroom and the request was that he use the pronouns?
Yeah. So interestingly, it's procedurally, I think, a fascinating case.
Excuse me. Welcome back, David. And we're just talking about how bad Judge Kyle Duncan really was or wasn't that instigated this kind of reaction to his coming to Stanford. And so Spencer was just telling a little bit about some of his controversial actions both before and after ascending to the federal bench.
Right.
So, the opinion, the procedural posture, I think, of the case is a little bit interesting. It's not something that, if I were just reading the popular press, it wouldn't really be clear what's going on. But what happened in the case is that there was an individual who had been found guilty of child pornography. I think it was like attempt to produce and distribute child pornography. There was a previous conviction for, if I remember correctly, a previous conviction for some kind of like molestation or something that had to do with child sexual abuse. And so obviously it's a serious case, and this individual had been found guilty and was in prison. And while in prison was when the individual decided to transition, and a transgender woman. And so in that moment, that was when she decided to file a motion with the court going back to change the name on the order that had put her in prison to her new name. And then in conjunction with that, she filed a motion on appeal because the district court had denied her motion to change the name on the order. And then when she appealed, she filed a motion that feminine pronouns be used as well. So that's my understanding of the case. Yeah.
Well, forgive me over here. I'm just an economist. That doesn't sound like a hanging offense. I don't understand how the moral energy, the kind of you endanger us, you offend us, you don't respect us. These are the kinds of sentiments that I saw in my review of what happened out there. I don't know where that comes from because if all that the judge did was what you described, there's something I'm missing. David?
I mean, there was also, before he joined the bench, his advocacy against, gay marriage. I think legally adopting it, although I perceive some moral objection as well. I think those two things were what the protesters took issue with.
Is Obergefell in danger with this conservative Supreme Court? That's a direct question to both of you.
Well, I can go first and say, practically speaking, I don't think so. I mean, I think, a lot of people at Stanford Law School were really concerned, when they read, for example, Justice Thomas's concurrence in Dobbs. I can speak personally. I'm a religious conservative, and I think even more importantly than that, frankly, I'm an originalist, and so I read the concurrence with great interest. But I think a lot of people were very upset and concerned. But frankly speaking, reading all of the opinions in Dobbs, if I'm going to read the tea leaves, no, I don't think Obergefell's in danger.
I would agree. I mean, speaking as a slightly right of center moderate who really likes gay marriage, I also as it's something of a formalist legally and originalist leaning. Like, Justice Thomas's opinion is interesting, but it was not joined by anyone else on the court. I don't think there are 5 who would be gung-ho on overturning gay marriage, if that makes sense.
Do you credit his concern that the legal reasoning behind the decision was faulty in some of the same ways that the legal reasoning behind Roe versus Wade was faulty, and that's worth pointing out, even if you don't want to go back and undo the precedent?
It's a perfectly legitimate concern, legally speaking. Certainly the substantive due process doctrine, to which I think Spencer takes a bit more umbrage than I do. But I mean, I'm not a huge fan either. There are critics on multiple sides, I would say. Yeah, I mean, for instance, Roe v. Wade, people on the left and the right, legally speaking, John Hart Ely, we're not huge fans of the decision and the legal reasoning. And Obergefell, it's a lovely opinion. I really enjoy Justice Kennedy's quoting Cicero, who's my hero. But I at the same time, it's not the best legal reasoning I've ever seen.
Well, people should know that's why David Sachs is near and dear to my heart. The man reads Latin and he reads Greek and he loves the classical Roman literary figures. And you don't find that every day, man. You just don't find that every day. But I wonder how popular a stance that kind of appreciation of the classical canon is at the Stanford Law School these days.
I don't think it's too popular.
I mean, Spencer seems to enjoy it when I mention the people. Like, some of our friends. But for the most part, people look at me like I have 3 heads. It's just fine.
Okay, while you were away, Spencer and I were chatting, and I was acknowledging that I had seen the viral, I guess it must have gone viral by now, video of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Dean Steinbach encountering Judge Duncan at the event. And the thing that I was most stunned by was that she gave a speech, and it wasn't just a spontaneous speech. She was reading a text, which meant that she took an hour or however long it took to compose, 1,000 words or whatever, and came in there, as it were, loaded for bear.
I mean, is it worth the pain that this causes and the division that it causes? Do you have something so incredible, important to say about Twitter and guns and COVID that is worth this impact on the division of these people who have sat next to each other for years, who are going through what is the battle of law school together so that they can go out into the world and be advocates? And this is the division that's caused. When I say, is the juice worth the squeeze, that's what I'm asking. Is this worth it? And I hope so, and I'll stay for your remarks to see, because I do want to know your perspective. And like all guests on our campus, we ask that you come with good intentions and respect. And I do want to hear your remarks, and I do want to say thank you for protecting the free speech that we value here of our speakers and of our protesters. And I want to remind you all of one thing. I chose to be here today. You all chose to be here today. Many people go before Judge Duncan who do not necessarily choose to be there. And they have to listen to everything he says. Literally thousands of people. You have a choice. You do not need to stay here if this is not where you want to be. You can stay here if this is where you want to be right now. But make that choice.
So pardon me for wondering, what is a diversity, equity, and inclusion dean got meddling her? Who cares what she thinks about these matters? With respect, I don't mean disrespect, but I just mean it doesn't seem to be pertinent to her portfolio. And can you help me understand that? She's representing the administration of the law school as she stands there, and yet she seems to be playing her diversity cards as opposed to her. This is an open forum where we want to encourage debate and so forth kind of cards. Either you want to speak to that?
Yeah,
ahead,
sure.
David.
Well,
Spencer, go ahead.
David. So I personally, I mean, I said I think this is pretty troubling. As you mentioned, at the top of the show, I've been at Stanford. My wife likes to make fun of me that I've been here forever and that I'll never leave. She expects me to sign up for a medical degree or something after this. So I've been at
your
Stanford.
dog Leland.
My dog is named Leland after the university. So I really love the place. I I like to think of myself as an institutionalist. I really love the school, right? But I've been here a long time, and I don't think I've ever seen a more brazen or troubling abuse of authority by anybody than what I saw at that event from Dean Steinbach, because I think that it was evident from both what she said and how she said it, and the context in which she said it. It was evident that Dean Steinbach sincerely believed that she was protecting free speech by promoting the protest and by encouraging us as the people who had invited the speaker to reconsider inviting speakers of his ilk again. And she encouraged the judge to leave, and that was free speech. And it was essentially an institutional endorsement of the heckler's veto. And I'm really heartened to see that Judge Martinez has since written, what I consider to be an excellent letter to the community. It was 10 pages, and I think it was really closely reasoned, arguing against the heckler's veto and arguing in favor of a true, freedom of speech on campus. But in that moment, I think it was something that really every professor, every member of the Stanford Law School faculty, and every member of the Stanford University community should be troubled by, that an administrator, put the stamp, the imprimatur of the university on this idea that we should cater to the crowd, and we should let them dictate what speech is worth the squeeze.
I think there are two things going on here, right? The first is, the understanding of the First Amendment betrayed in that moment was faulty. There's a right for the listener has been recognized in many decisions. The heckler's veto, by Dean Chemerinsky at Berkeley, by Dean Martinez over here at Stanford, and it was a great letter, it is not part of the First Amendment, and it's in fact antithetical to it. But the second value is, even independent of the legal reasoning, which if you read Dean Martinez's letter, like it was solid. California, Leonard Law, First Amendment writ large, it was solid. But also just the value of the university. Professor Loury and I have talked about this and taught on this for a while, and institutional neutrality and a Calvin report, which Dean Martinez cited, are absolutely essential. And free inquiry, reasoned discussion of multiple viewpoints in a civil manner, right? It's foundational. And in law school, it's one thing in college, although there it's just as bad. And we need to foster, values that support the Calvin report and institutional neutrality. But in law school, with adults who are going to become practicing attorneys who represent the best and worst and the right and the left of society, it was really quite astonishing, actually. So when the dean got up there and basically, endorsed the protest and said, undermined Judge Duncan's points by saying that that they have imposed direct harm on the students, and that in spite of that, she's welcoming him. On top of the 10 minutes of heckling, I just think that it really undermined the speaker, and it made it very difficult for the event to proceed.
I want people to know that Judge Martinez is the dean of the Stanford Law School, the overall dean, and Dean Steinbach is the diversity, equity, and inclusion dean. And what is your Dean Martinez first name? I forget.
Jenny?
Yeah, Jenny Martinez. And she issued an apology to Judge Duncan, as did the president of the university. And I understand that Dean Martinez of the Stanford Law School has met with not inconsiderable blowback for apologizing to a federal judge that he wasn't permitted at a law school to deliver 30 minutes of remarks. Help me understand that one. Again, I'm just a humble economist over here.
Yes, it's something that you learn quickly in law school, is that it's a mysterious place, and things happen that you don't fully understand. So Dean Martinez was protested for her apology, actually right after her, during and right after her constitutional law class, which David and I both are in this past quarter. we were in. So, the students protested. The great irony to me in watching them protest, they lined the halls so that when she walked out, they were all standing. They wore masks that said counter speech is speech. They held, signs. They had plastered the whiteboard with posters in the lecture hall, as well as the lectern. And, they were protesting the fact that there was an apology. But the great irony to me, aside from putting the posters up, which maybe we could talk about later, but, them standing with signs, with masks, lining the halls, while it was troubling in a lot of ways. And frankly, I don't agree with the substance of the protest. But the great irony to me is that if they had done that when Judge Duncan came, that would have been completely acceptable. There was no disruption there. They stood and they protested. They were seen, they were felt, they were heard, but they didn't disrupt class in the same way that they disrupted our event the week before, or I think it was 2 days before, actually. And so it shows that they knew, right? They knew the difference between disruption and protest. And that's to me the great irony. When they say counter speech is speech, the speech they engaged in that day when they protested Dean Martinez was indeed speech. That was a protected protest. But that is not the same thing as what happened with Judge Duncan. And I think that distinction is the whole point of this episode.
And this is made clear, that distinction, in Dean Martinez's letter, where she goes through the constitutional law issues of First Amendment protections and heckler's veto and so forth in great detail. I commend it to anybody who's interested in this case. It seems obvious that there is a substantial number of students who have a view about what is moral and ethical and correct at our day and time for decent people to think and to do. Now, you guys appear to have run afoul of that consensus. I don't know your thoughts about every issue, but you are openly, as I say, members of the Stanford Federalist Society, and you're here right now defending Judge Duncan, et cetera. What's that like? I mean, what's life for a conservative legal scholar in an elite law school? Stanford has got to be number 2, number 3, something like that. Number 2, you've overtaken Harvard.
Yeah.
Bravo. But in any case...
Who's counting?
Yeah, who's counting? I mean, number 2, number 3, and the graduates are going to go off to federal judge clerkships and to, junior associates at major corporate law firms, and to the staffs of senators and chairs of congressional committees, and et cetera. And I'm just wondering how it feels, forgive the kind of soft character of this question, but I'm trying to put myself in your shoes. And I mean, how do you show your faces? Your faces were plastered on posters. These are the bad guys who have invited this guy. What's that like?
Well, luckily the first years did escape that. It was the board of FedSoc. I don't think they've had a great time about it, but I won't speak to their experience. I mean, I'm one of the softer members of FedSoc, so to speak. I agree with some of the substance of the protest. I don't agree that Obergefell undermined our democracy or something. I think that's an overstatement, right? But I'm still conservative. I'm still branded as FedSoc, and luckily for me, and especially to speak to this as well, because we have different perceptions in the community, I would say. But yeah, I have friends who are left of center and right of center, and most people are quite fine about it and even friendly. There are a few who the feds suck sign of the protest kind of emblemizes what they think and often how they act interpersonally, especially after the event, to my, honestly, considerable sadness. I sense after this that there has been a bit of an abyss, as Professor McConnell wrote in the Wall Street Journal, that's formed. People who I had previously spoken to, sort of barely acknowledge me. I don't know if it's because they're embarrassed because the behavior of some of their fellows was a bit embarrassing, or because I showed up to listen. I can't say, but it's not always easy. And FedSoc, we are a bit ridiculed sometimes or looked at with some scorn, but overall it's not too bad. And it hadn't been anyway.
Spencer?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I do think it's important to understand that there's nuance to it, like David said, right? I mean, the reality in my experience has been that there are a lot of Stanford Law students and students at other law schools that I've interacted with who are extremely open-minded, which I think is a good thing for someone who's going to be an advocate. But there's a very vocal minority who is not open-minded. So I'm a Latter-day Saint, so I'm religious. I'm a religious conservative member of FedSoc, and people know that about me. I think this is true, of a lot of members of FedSoc around the country, but I know it's true for me. At the end of the day, I can go home to my wife and my dog and just enjoy my life, and I'm not as worried about what happens on campus, and what people think of me, they're going to think of me. But I'm going to keep trying to learn and pursue what I believe in. But I think that for a lot of students, especially those who live on campus at the law school, it can be a real struggle. And you see it, there's this real social pressure to conform. And that kind of brings me to what stuck out to me about this whole thing, which is, interestingly, one of the remarks that the hecklers yelled at Judge Duncan was, hey, you didn't get into Stanford. What do you know? And that stood out to me, right? He went to, if I'm not mistaken, went to LSU, right? Went to LSU Law School. Clearly he's smart, right? He's
a federal judge.
He was an incredible litigator. Say what you will about the issues he litigated, but as far as his actual skill, he's an incredible litigator, and now he's a federal judge. That really stuck with me, right? Because I think that sums up exactly what you were saying, Professor, about the fact that there's a certain hubris that accompanies this idea that, well, because I'm at Stanford Law School, I know what is moral for everyone else. And I have the requisite judgment to determine what is and is not thinkable, what is within the realm of acceptable conversation. My father didn't go to college. He works in construction. He's one of my greatest heroes. And I was thinking about that when they made that remark. I mean, who is to say that I am a greater moral authority than my father, who goes to work every single day to provide for his family, has provided a life for me and my brother and sister that, is given us these opportunities? Who's to say that, somebody in, whatever profession it is, who didn't go to Stanford Law School has less of a moral authority than you because you went and you learned the law? I mean, and that I think speaks to a greater issue, which is this idea that because you've learned the law, you've somehow become, this profound expert on moral theology, and you can now, tell us the alchemy of the universe and what is right and wrong, and you're going to determine that for us. To me, that's the most troubling aspect of this whole thing, is that law students at elite institution who are going to go on to become not just clerks and not just advocates and associates at major law firms, but eventually judges. These are the people who are going to trust to adjudicate impartially and fairly. And for far too many, their temperament is one of hubris. And I don't think that's everyone. I think there's a lot of open-minded people at Stanford Law School, like David said. But it's troubling to me as someone who is different and it doesn't always fit in with the status quo, that there are so many people willing to just write me and my beliefs off as irrelevant, even though I'm at Stanford Law School too, right? That's the great irony here.
It was a very telling remark, calling out his law school, the law school of a federal judge and celebrated litigator.
This is Duncan you're talking about?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The elitism was pretty astounding. It was an emblematic moment.
Well, there's this passage, as you will remember well, David, and as I'm sure you know, Spencer, in John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, where he says, it's not the magistrate that we have to worry about, the gendarme coming around and locking us up for saying something. It's the prevailing opinion and the conformity, the pressures to conform socially. And so I'm just wondering, you guys are out of the closet FedSoc members, but there must be people who harbor more sympathy for your views than they're willing publicly to state. And I'm just, I'm wondering about that, because this is the opportunity, isn't it, when one is in law school to fully explore all the different dimensions of all the complex and nuanced issues that are confronting the country and the legal profession. So, I mean, can you respond to this concern that I have, that this is a tip of an iceberg of tacit censorship and suppression of argument that undermines the intellectual integrity of the entire enterprise?
I think that's exactly right. I have had, throughout this quarter, and then even just the past several weeks, I've had several people come up to me after class in which maybe I made a remark, or after the protest and what happened. People have come up to me and said, "Hey, I just want you to know, I, really think that you made a great point there. Or, I really think you guys have the right to bring these speakers. I'm appalled by what happened. But, I'm sorry for not standing up for you back there, but I don't really want to, because, I don't want to get crucified for this. So I'm going to stay out of it."
I think there's an extent, again, to which FedSoc is kind of ridiculed and, seen as like, ooh, the FedSoc people, And I've heard it, but I think there's curiosity that might be tamped down by it. I know there are people who are like certainly interested in our ideas, but who shy away from any association. And I think when you assume so much that your view is correct, it comes across, and then discussion with someone who's more open to discussion, that person will probably react and not go there, and maybe not even think it's okay to think it. That's my experience with self-censorship, and I think it plays out at the law school too.
I'm interested in the aftermath. I noticed in Dean Martinez's letter that she had made the decision not to single out individuals for violating what were clearly violations of the relevant codes of conduct for the reasons that she stated. What do you think of her decision in that regard, if you're willing to say, and I understand if you're not? And what do you think should have happened, or should yet happen, to ameliorate some of the negative consequences of this unfortunate event?
Well, I can say, frankly, this might not be a popular view on my right flank, but I think she was right not to punish the students, for the simple reason that, something you learn in law school is that there's a real problem with punishing someone for a rule or a law that they, didn't know about, or that they had been misled by the person enforcing to believe would not apply. I think it's pretty clear that Dean Steinbach and the administration, that worked with the protesters, led them to believe that what they did was okay. And to me, the blame for what happened should rightfully land at the feet of the person who egged it on, which is Dean Steinbach. And I think blaming the students for that would be a mistake. I think if it's clear and people are told beforehand that, look, if you're going to disrupt this event, there will be consequences, and this is what you can expect, then it's up to them to make their decision on what they're going to do. And the incentives are clear enough that there's this weighing process that they're going to make as they approach their choices about how to protest. But I think Dean Martinez was correct in identifying that in this case, it certainly looks like the protesters were not crazy to think that the university and the law school particularly were okay with what they were doing. Which I think, moving forward, I think that just shows, the most baseline thing that to me it shows is that Dean Steinbach should not be in charge of free speech at Stanford anymore. I'm not saying that she should be fired necessarily, but I'm saying that if I'm running an event, I'm not going to trust her to come and actually defend our right to have an event on campus. And I think a lot of people feel like that, not just in FedSoc.
I would, sorry.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
No, I think that's a profound point about like sort of referencing the two principles we learned about, I think, in criminal law: rule of lenity and mistake. But I would just say that, like, I on the lenity hand, like, I think this is a fraught situation. I think, like Spencer said, people weren't clear on the rules necessarily, and I also respect people's feelings in the matter. I think it would be, in this instance, a mistake to crack down. I think the institutional response is fitting, and I think it hopefully affords us an opportunity to come together, build some bridges, cross the abyss.
I gather that Dean Steinbach has stepped away from her duties, at least temporarily. What's the status of, is she being reprimanded, or I ask,
Yeah, we don't know. We know she's on leave, but that's all that we know.
They don't comment.
One other thing I want to bring up here, the estimable Judge Kyle Duncan lost his cool a little bit, didn't he?
Yes.
He got pissed off, and he let everybody in the room know that he was pissed off. You think that, with respect to him, was a mistake?
Well, I can speak on this. I have a lot of respect for Judge Duncan, but I'll be frank that I think it would have been better for us if he hadn't, because it would have made the point clearer. But I'll say this. I think multiple things could be true at the same time, which is that when Judge Duncan got angry, that probably wasn't the best reaction. But also, he was provoked by blatant violations of the policy that would have allowed him to give his speech. So frankly, I'm not going to judge the judge too harshly, or as I hope just came across, even the protesters too harshly, because they were led astray by someone in a position of authority. To me, reading the media accounts of something that you've been at really drives home the fact that the media sometimes, in writing a story, they craft a narrative that's completely just divorced from what actually happened. And so it's been interesting to watch the media coverage of this. But the whataboutism has just been astounding. There are entire articles where the headline is, federal judge berates Stanford Law School students, and that's all they talk about. And then there are other articles that say, like, protesters yell down the judge, and then other articles that just talk about Dean Steinbach, but very few articles, I think, bring them all together. I think that's the issue, is that you can acknowledge that all of these things happened, but the only way to get to the heart of the matter is to see it all in context and recognize that what made this different than, for example, Yale, which we referenced earlier, where there have, historically, there was this event that was not too different from this, in which a speaker was shouted down, and they've had their free speech issues that hopefully they've kind of overcome now. But what makes this different than Yale's issue is that an administrator stepped in, and it was a federal judge. And so I think that's what I think we should be talking about, is the fact that the law school itself stepped in and condoned the heckler's veto. That's what makes this so remarkable. We know that students, unfortunately, will protest, and that sometimes they'll cross the line. But what makes this different is that the administrator not only stayed silent, but then got up to encourage it.
I would just add, I agree. I think it's well put. I think it's rich for anybody to sort of, truly put themselves in the situation of the judge and say, oh, I absolutely would have reacted calmly. I would have addressed it perfectly. Like, it was pretty bad. Because, we were in the audience together, Spencer and I, and, so we didn't see the whole thing, but the room was packed. There were signs everywhere. Some of the signs were totally legit, and some of them had, serious vulgarity that I think would have, especially somebody like, I don't know, the Christian faith, or I think it would be upsetting. I don't know. And and the sort of, he could feel, I think I'm quoting Ish, the utter contempt that they had for him. And I think when somebody feels contempt, they either slink away or they fight back. And Judge Duncan chose to fight back. Would I have reacted the same way? Again, I think it would be rich for me to say, oh yeah, absolutely not. Yes, he did punch back. I think it wasn't great for us, but I understand where he's coming from. And I think it is very important to note that, he was really egged on. I also think it took, I was going to say, I think it took everybody by surprise a little bit.
Yeah, well,
which was
and
curious.
just to jump in to kind of follow up on David's point, I just think it's important. I assume this is a family-friendly show, so we can't, really do this. But I think just to give some context of the weight of what was said.
We have used the F word on this show before. Just you don't have to use it, Spencer. But it has been used on this show.
That's comforting. It's a Sunday. I don't know. I'm trying to stay clean here. No, it was remarkable. Just the level, the degree of the vulgarity that was used. Right there was a whole sign and a shouted question about Judge Duncan's inability to find a certain female sexual organ that was shouted very loudly. There were a lot of discussion. There's a lot of discussion of the judge's sexual impotence. And then something that Judge Duncan explained in his op-ed, I didn't hear this because I wasn't there when he walked in, but apparently he said that someone yelled at him and said, direct quote, "We hope your daughters get raped."
I saw that.
So I think that it's important to understand the level of, it's not even just contempt at that point. The level, of just the invective that's being hurled at him at that moment. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that the judge got angry, that he lost his cool, but you look at the verbal abuse he was subjected to, and I think you start to understand what's going on there.
Let me offer this for your consideration. If a comparable event organized on the left were to have taken place, and a first-year law student was photographed in the audience holding up a sign for a gay rights advocate saying, "F you," or "you're a child molester," or something like that, that person would not be employable in any respectable law firm or, whatever, forever. That would follow them to their grave. It would be like appearing in blackface somewhere. Why not similar career consequences for people who violate norms of decency and respectability, such as what you've just described? I can say as an economist, the incentives induced by such a social practice would keep people from behaving like that.
I think that's exactly right. I think that there should be consequences. I think that there should be a high expectation and not just an expectation, but a high standard of conduct on the part of the university and just the legal profession generally. But we look at it. To even extend, I think you're counterfactual with the if a liberal judge or a gay rights activist came, how inappropriate it would be for us to protest that way and the kind of consequences we would face. If I said some of the things that were said just to a female classmate, that would be sexual harassment, because it was. That's what happened at Stanford Law School. Is a federal judge came and in protest, the students sexually harassed him by shouting sexual vulgarities at him about him, his wife, and his daughters. So, that's what we're talking about. This wasn't some protest, that was chock full of reasoned ideas. And if it had been that, although, again, I have my views on issues, a protest that's based in ideas is I think essential to what a law school does. That's great. But that's not what this was. And so, yeah, I think that the inability to rely on reason and perhaps the fear to even have an idea that you disagree with out in the air because you're worried that you're not going to be able to counter it with a strong argument. I think that absolutely does speak to one's ability to be an effective advocate and to be an effective member of the legal profession, where our entire job is to make arguments and to confront all objections to those arguments, even the ones we find unpalatable.
I think that's right. I would just say, look, some lenity is appropriate. I hope that Dean Martinez's free speech conference, so to speak, towards the beginning of next term, helps enforce rules of conduct that are essential to the profession. It's just at the same time, I get it. People have feelings, their feelings, I think, in that moment of group protest, shall we say, were very raw, and I think they acted in a way that I'm sure not all of them were proud of it. I hope they, like the conduct improves going forward. I think it will. Most of our colleagues are certainly very respectable in that regard.
Okay. What's next for FedSoc Stanford? What have you got on tap? How has your experience here affected your thinking about the role of the organization at Stanford Law going forward? If you want to share it without tipping your hand to your adversaries, what's your next move?
Well, I think I can just say with absolute confidence that we're going to keep doing what we do, which is we're going to invite the best speakers that we can find. And historically speaking, I think that this is going to remain true despite the best efforts of protesters on campus. Actually, I think that the protests might have been counterproductive in this way. Some of the top talent and top most significant voices in the conservative legal movement are now signing up and waiting to come to Stanford because they want to come speak to us, and that's what we're going to do, right? We're David alluded to this earlier, but we're not monolithic. We have a diversity of views within our Federalist Society chapter, and we're going to bring people that interest each and every member of the chapter to come and explore those ideas, and we're not going to be intimidated or bullied into conforming with the status quo. No, we're going to challenge ourselves to understand what different perspectives are out there, even when we don't even agree with them. Just because I think this episode has made clear that FedSoc's really important to the law school, to a law school who has only one conservative public law professor. I think it's really valuable to have a different perspective on campus. And that's something that I hope, is not left to us alone. I hope that the law school also, in the name of diversity and inclusion, starts to try to bring in other perspectives at the faculty level as well.
I think we play an important role in the marketplace of ideas at Stanford. It's something that we were concerned about at Brown, I know, and the Federalist Society plays an important role, not just in that regard, but look, it's a coalition of libertarians and conservatives who have sort of a range of judicial philosophies within that mostly adhere to sort of history, text, and tradition. But there is some flexibility. I mean, it is not a monolith. And we've brought in great speakers, incredibly intelligent judges, who, like Judge Duncan, like Judge Newsom last year, and we will continue to do that. And we will continue to, contribute to the intellectual, wealth of our community. And I hope everybody who wants to attend does so and asks good questions.
Could Justice Thomas come to Stanford Law and speak without incident?
I hope he does. Please come, Justice Thomas.
Please do come, Justice Thomas.
I don't have an inside track, but it should be known in the world that you guys would welcome the presence of Justice Clarence Thomas at the Stanford Law School. And
Wholeheartedly.
Now, I gather in lieu of any kind of reprimand of individual students, Dean Jenny Martinez has mandated some kind of required seminar or something on the issues of free speech. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that, I'm going to wait and see what happens. We don't have a lot of details yet. I appreciate the instinct to do something. And although it's not really always true that doing something is better than doing nothing, in this case, I at least appreciate the gesture, and I'm hopeful. It could be a really great event. To be honest, I am not entirely sure that the problem here was that students at Stanford Law School, who on the whole are very intelligent in my experience, I don't think the problem is that they don't understand free speech. I think the problem is, to your point, Professor, I was an economics undergrad, but I don't want that to make you think I know anything about economics, but maybe at one point I did. But I can tell you that the incentives are out of whack for sure, where perhaps there's not only not incentives to discourage, not only are there not incentives to discourage this kind of behavior, but in fact, there are a lot of incentives that run the other way that encourage people for social reasons, but also I think for professional reasons in certain ways to be involved in these kind of disruptive protests. And I think that the law school just simply needs to enforce its policy. That at the end of the day is all it is. And, what did Justice Scalia say? That we need a rule of law, not a rule of men. The law school, we just need to follow our own rules, which should be pretty easy for lawyers to do, you'd think.
Yeah, I have hopes. I think it could be good for everybody to get together and talk about free speech under sort of the awning that's articulated in Dean Martinez's letter, the Calvin report, case law that very clearly lays out what's what, and policy, that again was very clearly laid out in that note. And I think she says, policy will be put more strongly, phrased more strongly in weeks and months to come. And this event will probably be part of that. So, I'm optimistic. I think it could be a good time for reflection and exchange. At least I hope it will be.
Okay. You guys got anything you want to add?
No, I think the biggest thing I would just add is that, despite all of this happening and despite the many calls I've gotten from friends and family asking, what in the world's going on at your school? Like I said earlier, I'm still proud to be, a Stanford man through and through. I've got my dog Leland, who just, walked under my feet, and his name is not going to be changing anytime soon. Like David said, I'm optimistic. I really think that I think that it's our obligation, as students, but also as lawyers, to take the institutions we're in and to try to make them better instead of trying to tear them down. And I think that that's what we saw in the protest, was this willingness to burn down a whole institution because you're convinced you're right about something. And I think that's really dangerous. I think that's really dangerous coming from an attorney, because, it's like a principal agent problem. An attorney is never the principal. An attorney is always the agent. You're always acting both. I think it's twofold, both on behalf of your client to represent their views, even when you don't agree with them, and represent their position, their best interests, but also to represent the law, not as you want it to be, but as it is. You swear an oath to uphold and support the Constitution and the laws of the land when you become an attorney. So that's kind of how I look at it, is hopefully we'll all work together to support this institution we're in and try to make it a place. I think it's the best place in the country to be a law student, whether you're conservative, progressive, or wherever else you might land. And I hope that that inspires all of us to work together, including people who aren't FedSoc members, to try to make this a space that truly values a diversity of viewpoints, and that is the best place to explore those viewpoints in the country.
Yeah, I would just say that, Spencer got calls from friends and family. I mean, obviously I did too, but many of my friends were at the law school and liberal, who were concerned about what happened at that protest. And even people I was even able to talk to people at the protest about it, and we had, I think, a productive discussion. Look, I want mutual respect. Especially since working with you and John Tomasi, Professor. I really care about mutual respect in this whole thing. I think it's important to be kind and to respect each other's viewpoints, even when that does come to feelings. I would just say that Spencer's perspective from the law is entirely right, and I also think that legal realists might want the law to change, but you also have to, even if you are a legal realist, you have to deal with the law that exists and is now, right? And I would say also that Stanford remains a school. The law school is a great opportunity to actually encounter all of these ideas, to think deeply about the law, philosophically, politically, all of the implications, all of what undergirds it. It's a great opportunity to think about that, and that involves a discussion that hinges as much as any university or graduate program on free inquiry and the free exchange of ideas, right? That has to be primary at an educational institution. And that was, and I think people are too ready to dismiss that. I know that I am not, and I think what got me the most about that event, because again, legal aspects aside, I get where some of the protesters are coming from, especially I'm a big fan of gay marriage, like I said, I think it's great. But the primary value here is free inquiry and the free exchange of ideas in the university, and that was just demolished. So I hope it, but Dean Martinez stood up for it, and I think, and so I shouldn't say demolished, because I think I'm optimistic that it will stand and be reaffirmed more strongly than ever.
Good to hear from you guys. Spencer Segal, David Sachs, both first-year law students at Stanford, Federalist Society members, and excellent ambassadors of the conservative legal movement. I think your moderation and your empathy and your balance and your coolness of commitment to the law, and you're not making yourselves into victims, and you're not ranting and raving and casting aspersions. You present yourselves very well. So I'm proud of you, David.
Thank you, Professor.
I'm going to sign off here at the Glenn Show. Thanks a lot to Spencer Segal and to David Sachs.
Thanks, Professor.